All right. Our next talk is passwords to passwordless. Our presenter, Wolfgang, is an advisory CISO for Cisco Secure. He has been responsible for IT and IT security in the healthcare and financial service vectors. Wolfgang has led advisory and assessment practices for cybersecurity consulting firms. And he likes to gesture.
See, all through that, I was like, how long am I going to let him read out that very boring bio?
Yeah, I had made up another one for you, but I wasn't sure if we should.
You should. It's like, this is this guy. He's in InfoSec.
He's a Tai Chi master. He's a superhero on the side, and
You're not supposed to say that one though, right? It's like, take off the glasses. Oh my God, I've been doxxed. Okay, so am I good?
You're good.
I'm good. All right.
Let's go.
Thanks for coming out. So we're going to be talking about credentials and moving away from the shared secret. That's the topic of the day. As already mentioned, I'm an advisory CISO. Some of this is CISO level, right? We'll get a little bit in the weeds. But it's not necessarily going to be like, oh, by the way, here's what you should be configuring Hashcat to run, and here's how you dump this out. No, this is more of a defense. It's more of a configuration talk. And, we've been having this problem with credentials for a very long time, like right back to the early days of hacking. This has been a problem. Early days of hacking, like anyone remember where like the word hacker got start from? Like anyone? No? Yes? Maybe? People are like, I have no idea. Like MIT, right? MIT Model Railroad, way back in the day. So you could have yelled that out. You could have just left me. No, just. I'm just here to watch. Okay, that's fine. But what I thought was interesting, right? So MIT Railroad, Model Railroad is where the term hacking gets started. And what I really thought was interesting was like hackers were now disrupting train lines as part of acts to sabotage Russians going after Ukraine. And I'm not advocating hacking. I'm not advocating criminal hacking, but I thought that was really cool. Like it was a cool tie-in. Like historically, we started off playing with model trains and now we are wrecking real trains. Nice arc. But at MIT, another thing happened. It was this guy. This guy's the IBM 7094, known for two things. I'll tell you one now. I'll tell you the second one later. IBM 94, first thing it was known for at MIT was being the very first system to ever have a password. 1960s, 6 decades ago. It's also the very first time there was a password breach. Because within a very short period of time of them putting in a password to make sure that they're having controls over this, we had accounting, we know what students were using it. Within a very short time, people were like, okay, that sucks. I'm going to take those passwords out. I'm going to print them. Somehow accidentally, the password file got loaded up into the message of the day file. So whenever you logged in, you get a new message. Oh, by the way, someone else's password is this, right? It did not take long. It did not take long for passwords to go off the rails. But this started effectively this cat and mouse game that we played for a long time. We either demand more of the machine or we demand more of the human. We either demand people have more passwords, frequently changed passwords, rotated passwords, all this sort of stuff. Or we're like, you know what? Probably the password shouldn't be in clear text. Maybe we shouldn't allow them to be loaded in the message day file. Maybe we should encrypt them. Okay, that's cool. And then, of course, the minute you encrypt them, someone's like, all right, well, now I can get at those, and now I can figure out a way to decrypt it. Okay, fine, we'll move it to a shadow file. Okay, yeah, but now I can get at it this way. Okay, fine, we'll move it over here. Okay, yeah, now I can do this. And we've had this long-lived cat and game mouse as adversaries have been going after credentials. Meanwhile, always asking more for the people. So what I want to look at today is where we're going with passwordless, getting rid of this password that we've been stuck with for 60 years, why we can't get rid of it all the way, even though I wish we could. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about risk-based authentication, how we're going to handle biometrics and these sort of things. So first off, on the nature of passwords, one more thing about passwords. I find a little bit of nostalgia for early passwords. Like if you think about like the first time you created a password, you sit down, you think about a password, you probably put some time in. It's not like spring 2022, right? You put a little bit of time in it. What does it mean? What is this shared secret that I'm going to tell the computer? I remember some like early jokes that I used to use, and those were great. And then you get to your second and your third and your fourth, and then you've been in the industry for a while, and no longer is it fun. But it isn't just us who do that. When we looked at some of like the historical figures in computing and cracked their passwords, this was done against the BSD backups recently. Like Ken Thompson, right? Ken Thompson who defined so much of the Unix thinking, and of course, behind Google, his password was a chess move. I like that. That's cool. That's cool. Eric Schmidt, again, of Google and everything else, his password was his wife's name plus exclamation marks. Ahead of his time, we all know you add an exclamation mark, your password's more secure. Much better with an exclamation mark. So I like that, right? It's kind of sweet. It's kind of nice. And I like some of that nostalgia, like, oh, by the way, if you walk around, you might see people sticking sticky notes with passwords. I also like that idea. It's been a long time since I did any sort of assessment. When I was a security officer, I think it was the last time, maybe 10, 15 years ago, when I walked around and I would look for sticky notes. It's been a long time since I actually saw that in the wild. Anyone see like a sticky note in the wild with a password recently? A couple of people are like, yeah, we still see that all the time. Okay, you're shooting my idea in the foot. But I think sometimes we like there's too much to write it down. Was that at home or was that in the office? Oh, now you're breaking my heart. Okay, so that's still a problem. So people are stupid with passwords. We pick things that are easy to remember. And so what are we going to do? We're going to demand more of the machine. We're going to add in multi-factor, as we already know, any number of different multi-factor options. Of course, then we've got additional problems with multi-factor because, as with any control, the minute it gets to a certain level of maturity, it's prime for being attacked. I don't know what that maturity level is. I feel like it's like a third, right? Like if no one's doing it, you're pretty good. The first people who block like zip files on emails were gods among men. Like no one can attack me because everyone's sending zip files. And then enough people are doing that and we switched to ISO. I'm like, we stopped them until they started doing IMG files and so on and so forth. Right? There's some sort of threshold there when enough people are using a control that suddenly the adversaries are like, you know what? I'm not going to like ignore this anymore. I'm going to actually spend some time and I'm going to go ahead and put a control in place. And that's what we're seeing with multi-factor today. So attacks like SIM swapping and Ss7 attacks. SIM swapping, of course, pretty well known. I walk into the store, I pretend that I'm you. I asked for the manager. I say, I lost my phone. This sucks. Like, I should help you, sir. Yes, you should, because I need my phone immediately. Can you at least give me a new SIM card? And then I give you a SIM card, and then you're suddenly that person. Not something that we're going to deploy against everybody. I mean, that's a pretty manual effort. SIM swapping attacks are still a pretty manual effort, but something we definitely see for high worth clients, high value targets, anyone who has a lot of money in their crypto wallet and is bragging about that money and also has SMS as their multi-factor. So SIM swapping. Ss7 attacks, again, not something we're going to see in mass. You've got to actually take control of the cell tower or convince people to join your cell tower to do this. Not something you see very often. I think the last time I saw it, I was in a conference in Indianapolis. I was actually with my wife, right? And so we're having some coffee and we're having a good time. And she's like, why does my phone look weird? And I pull out my phone, I'm like, oh yeah, apparently we're in Shanghai. That's weird. You turn off your phone. Just shut it all down. Because they convinced a bunch of people to de-auth from the tower, join their micro tower or microcell setup. And of course, we're well positioned for Ss7 attacks. So Ss7 attacks are a thing if you have physical access. What else we got? Symmetric crypto, duplicate code generation, golden Saml attacks. That's fun. So what happens once you authenticate, get past all the authentication altogether, if you get a hold of a token, then you can go ahead and pass that token around, as we see in Kerberos. We're also seeing that in the web world. Golden Saml in particular, we saw CyberArk founded, I think, in 2017, and then we saw it in some recent attacks like SolarWinds, where you just go ahead and get the certificate, and you print off as many Saml tickets as you want, and then you bypass all of MFA altogether. Cool. And then push phishing, where you get 1,000,001 push phishing. I don't know that we got a good name for this. I've heard brute force, I've heard phishing, but basically you just keep sending someone attempt after attempt after attempt until they finally say yes, which is really frustrating if you've configured your environment to allow like 100 people to send pushes to this poor, pathetic person who's just trying to do their job. No, that's not me. No, that's not me. No, that's still not me. No, that's not me. Well, I guess maybe it's me. And boom, then they're in, of course. And then proxy, like Evil Engine X, which is really kind of clever. I'm going to convince someone that they're actually authenticating into a valid site and then steal their username and get them to do a push. And in the meantime, I'm going to proxy that in and log in as them and use that push to, or that multi-factor to authenticate. So we get a whole bunch of stuff. So the answer obviously is biometrics. Like we were talking about earlier in the last session, we'll just do fingerprint, we'll do facial recognition, everything will be great. Except for not, because when you look at crossover error rates and other things, there's a high likelihood that you can spoof biometrics, as we've seen quite frequently. The Talos team did it, in 2020? Which really, I mean, you had enough going on in 2020. Why spend 2020 doing this? But they would take people's fingerprints, 3D print them, and then use that to log into devices. I thought that was fantastic, right? I'm going to rely on my biometrics. So, okay, cool. By the way, thank you for touching that glass. Now I 3D printed it, and now I'm logging in your phone. I love that. It's so like James Bond, Mission Impossible. Love that idea. So, what are we doing for multi-factor? Is it still good? Yeah, it's much better than nothing else. Is there a lot of attacks coming out of it? Yes. Are a lot of these attacks likely? Probably not. I doubt many of us are going to have our fingerprints 3D printed. I doubt very much that people are going to try to steal our SIM cards. I doubt very much that people are going to take over our towers. But of course, these are attacks that we're all worried about. So it's possible, yes. Is it likely? Not necessarily. So this gets us to passwordless. All right, so now we're going to think about how do we just get rid of that shared secret altogether? How do we put in place some good controls, understanding that the underlying multi-factor stack, as I mentioned, is under attack. So the idea with passwordless is we're going to remove that shared secret, at least remove it from the people who know about it. I'm not going to worry about a chess move. I'm not going to worry about my wife's name. I'm not going to worry about the exclamation marks. I'm going to abstract all that. I'll still need some way to identify myself to the application. I'll still need some way to authenticate and get in, but I'm not going to do it with a shared factor. So why now? Right? We've been talking about passwordless for a while. Again, it's 1960s. We're on a mainframe, and people are already pissed off about passwords. We've had this problem for a very long time. Why now? In the early 2000s, Bill Gates stood on the RSA stage and said, "We shall kill the password in 2 years." And everybody cheered. And then we're now in 2022. So why now? Why are we making some progress? Well, a couple of things have changed. First off, is enough people now have mobile phones or other devices, and enough people are enrolled in multi-factor, so they've got a strong way of authenticating, right? We've effectively given everybody a biometric sensor that they're carrying around. I say everybody, I'll come back to that because of course it's not everybody. Secondly, we've gotten a good standard. So FIDO, which does the UTF and the YubiKey, have come up with FIDO 2 standard, which I'll talk about in this talk a little bit. And the FIDO 2 standard allows us to do passwordless authentication with applications. So we've got a good standard, we've got the good infrastructure, we've got the good capability to move forward. Now it's just a matter of making sure enough people adopt it. So that is the overall idea. However, we can poke a lot of holes in that pretty quickly. First off, I'm not about to stand on the stage and say passwords would be dead in 2 years. I wish I could. But I talk about passwords, I'm like, this is what it is. And they're like, that's great. Our workforce is hourly. We don't even give them email addresses. Like, what do you mean? That's great, but we've got a whole bunch of workers that don't necessarily have phones, and we can't require them to log in with their phones. But what do you mean? Passwords are going to be dead. That's great. But my applications don't even support Saml yet, and Saml's been a standard for 10 years. Okay, so we have some problems here. This is the reality. This is what makes it possible. But we do have some problems with application vendors picking up the standard and supporting it, even though major manufacturers like Apple and Microsoft and Google all support it from a browser level. We have some problems with the reality of how many people in the workforce would have the ability to do strong factor authentication without providing keys and whatnot. Because again, in a lot of environments, we can't require people to have smartphones or use their smartphones on the job. So there's some things that are going to hold this up a little bit. But it's a good place to start. So if we can get to passwordless, for the people we can get to passwordless, for the haves, not the have-nots, for the situation where I've got someone who's got a smartphone, who's got an application stack that supports it, that have everything in place, we can finally actually improve security while improving usability, which is something we never get to do. Very rarely in a security team do you get to show up and be like, hey, I'm here to make your life easier. As a matter of fact, I suppose if you showed up and said that, they wouldn't believe you and they would probably walk away very quickly. That may be born partially out of personal experience. I'm here to make your job better, come back. No, I mean it this time, right? Very rarely do we get to actually improve things from a usability perspective, which is why I'm excited about this technology stack. So how we're going to get there, some of the steps along the way that I'll talk about for the next about half hour or so is looking at the multi-factor side of it, consolidating authentication workflows so we can make things easier that way, and then looking at the trust side. We already know we're going to have some problems with the different factors that people are logging in on. How can we increase trust in the system? Moving those things to passwordless and then optimizing for the overall tool set. That's the general path that we're going to take in our time together. All right, from a multi-factor perspective. So at its core, what we're doing with passwordless is we're taking a password plus a multi-factor, and then we're removing that password, right? At its core, from a user perspective, that's what we're doing. On the back-end perspective, we're replacing that password. If we're doing it with the FIDO2 perspective, we're replacing that password still with a secret, but it's no longer a shared secret. It's a derived secret based on the biometric. So I log in with my biometric into my device. My device opens up the secure enclave. The secure enclave has the key material. Exchange happens, and I'm able to log into a device or an application. So that's what we're doing on the website. On the Windows side, what we're effectively doing is we're logging in, and we're using certificate-based authentication to log into Windows environments. So we're still getting our Kerberos, we're still getting our NTLM v2 hashes, except for it's not having shared secret material anymore. Now it's having PKI, certificate-based authentication. So we take the password, we get rid of the password. We already know, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of problems with a lot of these factors. So right away, what we want to do is start removing some of those factors from play. We're probably not going to want to do SMS-based multi-factor. We're probably not going to want to do email-based multi-factor. We're probably not going to want to do some of those ones that are really well known to be attacked. For the things that remain, things like push and whatnot, we're going to want to put in place good controls to prevent people from doing the proxying or doing the brute force where we send a bunch of requests in. So we want to bolster those remaining factors. From there, when we authenticate in, effectively looks something like this, right? If I log in, we know this today, username and password, I'm in. We take away the password, so now we've got a passwordless authentication. We run into our next problem that we're going to run into, which seems to be on the rise with technical innovation. Compliance, right? A lot of compliance standards aren't necessarily geared towards what we do, as just like a side note. Inventory is a good one, right? Thou shalt have a fantastic inventory that is maintained and blessed and everything is checked in and checked every 3 months. Sounds like a great control. In compliance standards, awesome, let's do it. Okay, then you go to do it in your SaaS applications and your DevOps people are like, does that mean I have to maintain my instances for 3 months? Because I usually spin them up and spin them down a couple of days, sometimes a couple of weeks. Why are we maintaining these things this long? You look at things like, oh, thou shalt bless and do access reviews. Great. And then you look at the managers and like, yeah, we're asked to do that every 3 months. And we just click yes to everything. Great control. Also, what happens with gig workers? Don't worry about that. We've outscoped them. Okay, great control. Compliance oftentimes, as we all know, is not exactly aligned with what we're trying to do. So from a multi-factor perspective, what's interesting is organizations that have adopted passwordless early are like, okay, that's great, but you still have to do multi-factor. And you tell the auditor, well, I mean, the weakest factor is the password. Okay, I get that, but now you only have one factor. So you still need to do multi-factor to be compliant. All right, so what we need to start thinking about is how to do multi-factor with a passwordless workflow. So it really is 2 factors to do the authentication. And we can do that with things like biometric into your phone and then do the second step into the application. It's one way to do it. You can do things like biometric in your phone plus a YubiKey. There's different ways to combine those things, but the overall idea is have still 2 factors. So when you're authenticating in, you can still meet the compliance requirement, as well as mitigate some of the risk of any one of those factors getting compromised. All right, and do it in one step. Why not? As again, from the user perspective, the main benefit here is usability. Okay, from a FIDO perspective, there's four main use cases from FIDO. First one is exactly what we've been talking about. I use my device to log in to an application. I open it up. There's a challenge response. The challenge is sent. The key material is exchanged. I am able to authenticate. It's not shared secret. Also, what's kind of cool about that is it is looking at the URL when it's doing that process from a FIDO2 perspective. So if you think about most phishing, which is I sent you an email, it's got a quirky URL, I trick you to link on it. I click on that link and now I give you my creds. Now we're in. That type of workflow is predicated on, of course, having a URL that does not match what the user is expecting. So within FIDO, they automatically do that checking for you before they exchange the key material. Pretty cool, reduces an avenue of phishing. The FIDO people will say this will completely stop phishing. I will say that if enough people are using it, all the other phishers will find other avenues of bypassing your security because the phishing people are not going to give up. But for one very well-known, very used factor of phishing, that eliminates it. One of the problems with this is it is predicated on a user and device to application model. So if I've just got me and my device to authenticate, that's fine. What happens if I switch to another device? What happens if I'm using that device for multiple companies? Again, like the gig worker use cases. What happens if I've got a shared computer that multiple people are authenticating to? So think call centers, think healthcare where people are just walking up to a terminal and using it, those types of use cases. In those scenarios, it doesn't necessarily work because they're not going to want to enroll everyone's biometrics and everyone's data into one device and be able to share that out. So the next way that FIDO2 allows is effectively for a bound external authenticator. So this would be similarly to like a UTF token. So you can imagine I've got my token, I walk up, I set my token down on the reader, and I use that to go ahead and authenticate and get in. So now I can work around multiple devices. I can have one key to log into everything, and I can use that along with the FIDO2 protocol to complete the authentication. So, bound external authenticator. Another way of doing this is roaming external authenticator. So if you don't necessarily want to bind it, but you, again, have one of these use cases where you've got multiple different devices or shared devices using that method. Now, with all three of these, we're sending all the data through the front channel. So when I'm doing this authentication, WebAuthn is doing its flow to authenticate me in. Be it either something that's bound to the device with CTAP or something that I'm carrying that's roaming. Challenge here is a couple things. One, front end, as we know from looking at Saml, OAuth, OADC, front end is oftentimes at risk because it's going through the browser, it's going through the device. If there's an adversary that's doing a man in the middle or a man in the browser attack, we can have some risks there. Another concern with this, of course, is that means that application has to support WebAuthn, has to support FIDO2. I mentioned earlier, a lot of things still don't support SAML. The uptick in these things can be really a problem. So the final mode that's evolving is using this on the back end to do the access devices. So the person goes in and authenticates the application stack. The application stack, this is usually an SSO portal or something else, goes and does the FIDO2 exchange with a remote or roaming authenticator. So this would be something like push or something else. So I'd open up my application, and the application stack on the back channel would handle that, and I'd complete my auth. So those are the four main patterns that FIDO2 is looking at. The first one, again, is predominantly a consumer-based pattern. It's my device. I've got my biometric on it. It doesn't leave my hands. It only goes to the things I've enrolled it on. The last one is emerging more as the workforce pattern. So from an authentication perspective, we do that username and password. We add the MFA, and we get that MFA enrolled, and we get it in the state where enough people have that multi-factor so that we can start removing the password. That's step one of this process. Another risk to consider here is ensuring that we don't open up potential avenues through downshifting of factors or through recovery of factors. So if enough people are doing this, what are the adversaries going to do? Well, we've seen people go through and, for a long time, downshift protocols, right? Downshift methods. So if I allow SIM and I allow biometric and both are enrolled, well, why am I not going to just use the SIM attack from an adversary perspective? So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. In addition, the enrollment side is really important. If you look at like the SolarWinds attack, again, was really instrumental with this. One of the ways they caught it, of course, was someone enrolled a factor on that user. And then when that was identified, that was alerted and they went and investigated it. So how people are able to do identity proofing and recovery and enroll devices will oftentimes set the floor of the security model. It's no problem. I've got the greatest factors in the world. Okay, I've lost it. Now I call the help desk and they say, okay, what's your employee number? I give my employee number. They say, what's the name of your dog? I give them the name of the dog. All right, sir, we reset you. Go ahead and add whatever device you want. That's going to be the primary factor that gets attacked with this. And I already mentioned the downshifting factors, so just click through those. All right, the next step we need to do is think about not only fewer passwords, but also fewer auths. So think about consolidating the workflows. For applications that do support that SSO process, for applications that do support Saml, let's bring them on into one portal so we have one place to configure, as opposed to going to each one of those applications and configuring it out. So one of the reasons why I think that I don't see the sticky note problem anymore. I know you guys said you still see it. I don't find it very often. I think part of the problem is there's just too many sticky notes. There's just too many damn passwords we got to trace. The stats show 191 passwords at the moment is the normal for the workforce. I think I'm around like 400 last time I checked. Somewhere within there is where we all exist. So trying to keep track of that, of course, is a significant problem, as well as that's what leads people to do reuse, that leads to compromise of any one, being passed over, et cetera, et cetera. So what we want to do at this stage is effectively move in as many of the applications into a federated model through SAML, through OAuth, through I2C, move them in and do that passwordless authentication into that SSO portal. So configure it once, and then that would apply to everything else downstream. Particularly good when you think about how many applications enterprises have. 1,400 is the stat I've seen. Particularly good when you start thinking about all the application endpoints too. There was a study that showed out there's over 15,000 API endpoints per organization. I thought that was just absolutely incredibly crazy. So are we doing authentication on those? Oh, sure, of course we are. Absolutely we are. Absolutely we are. I was going back and forth with a guy on Twitter about this. He's like, there's no way that I have that many API endpoints. I'm like, oh, that's fine. That's what the stat shows. He goes, that means that I'm probably missing like 10,000 API endpoints. I'm like, yes, it does. And you probably are. And I started thinking about like, when I was doing application inventories early on, I thought I had like 200. Like I've got 200 business apps. That's what I showed in the spreadsheet. That makes sense. And I put up a CASB and it was like 1,500, right? You put out something that shows how many devices are attaching to your application. You think you have probably 2 devices per user. They got their corporate device. They got their BYOD phone, probably about 2. And invariably, it's like 10,000 more devices than we know. So I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if we don't have the same problem in the API stack. Why that's an issue is because if we've got an API that's configured where we can just accept a username and password, get a token back, we can then pass that token around and authenticate other things. We saw this happen with O365. I want to say 3-4 years ago. They were able to authenticate in, get a token, even if the user had MFA enabled because of some of the legacy protocols, pass that in then to SharePoint and other services that were checking the MFA and were fully authenticated by bypassing it. So we've got a good inventory of these applications. We've got a good inventory of the API endpoints because that's where people are going to work around this. The other problem we're going to run into at this stage is any legacy stuff. So I talked to banks. Banks are like, oh yeah, it's great. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. So how do I do it for RACF? Like, you don't right now because mainframes are not going to support it. And they probably won't for any period of time. Is there any like path to get off the mainframe? Like, yeah, in 10 years. I'm like, okay, all right, cool. So the idea of like application access proxies and auth proxies becomes very important in these legacy use cases. And again, for a lot of industries, they have tons of legacy use cases. So I'd love to stand on a stage and say the password is going to be dead in 2 years. But the reality is we're going to be continuing to run into legacy protocols, unprotected APIs, unknown applications. And these are the main gaps that adversaries are going to use to work around the solution. These are also the main gaps that are going to prevent us from going full on password. So we'll probably be in a hybrid environment for some time. But as much as possible, we can identify them, bring them in, integrate them with things like Saml and OAuth and ODC. We could be in a good point as long as, again, those integration points are enforcing passwordless and allowing us to bypass it. All right, so now we got someone logging in to something we know that's modern. We're going to have some environment that's out of scope, some exceptions, but something that log in that's modern. They're connecting up and they're going in and opening these applications. At that point in time, we need to start thinking about what additional things could we miss? What additional vectors could criminals use to get in? What additional ways could they bypass the factors? One of the things I think is really intriguing about FIDO2 is it really takes the effectively zero trust approach where they say, okay, it's not only just a user logging in, but it's a user logging in on the device. Now that can be a big problem, as I mentioned earlier, if it's just one user on one device in a consumer use case. But that mapping of these are the devices we expect a person to come into, and this is what they're coming in from, is pretty rigorous from a security property because it reduces our attack surface, right? It can't just be someone in another country on another computer with a stolen cred getting in. It has to be one of the devices we expect. So device identity becomes important. The other thing that becomes important is what happens once they're in, just in case we've got some residual problems. So the very first thing we need to do is make sure that we've got really good device identities. That could be through cert-based authentication mechanisms. That could be agent-based mechanisms. Cert-based is, of course, really good, strong properties. We can trust PKI as long as we've got good PKI management and that can't be bypassed. See also what I was saying about the golden Saml cert problem, where if they could get at that certificate that was being used by ADFS, they could just keep printing out Saml assertions. If we can get at the certs, obviously that undermines the whole thing. But if we got good cert management is the way to go. If not, then that's when we're looking at things like agents. If we can put agents in place on the devices, if it's BYOD, there may be some pushback on that. We may have some ramifications to deal with on that side. But different ways of authenticating those devices, and then pairing in the back end that device with the user. The next thing is to make sure that the device is really up to date. Again, thinking about the attack surface, how do we control that? How do we make sure that it is a pretty restricted environment, that it's patched, that we've got a password on it, that firewall's on it, that's not jailbroken, all those sort of things. In addition to that, one of the things I think is important on this side of things is if we imagine a world where everyone is using passwordless and everyone is using a protected device. We imagine that world and the adversary cannot possibly log in from any other device as that person. The next thing they're going to do is try and convince that user to install some software in the box and wait till they log in and then follow that trusted session in. That type of remote attack that we see so often in the consumer space right now, where people are just, it's John Doe from Microsoft support. Please click on this link. I'm here to protect you. And they click on the link and now they're in their environment and logging into whatever they want to log into. That type of attack path is what we'll start seeing more and more of. So we also want to make sure that the computer isn't infected, right? That it's integrated with the AV or the EDR and it's making sure that the computer's in a known good state. So basic checks. Do the basic fundamental checks, the if this, then that checks to rule out any risk and make sure that we've got really good understanding of that device and the device is hardened and everything else. From there, then we can go ahead and do something a little bit more interesting. We can go ahead and look at some of the patterns and behaviors and whatnot. I mentioned that this computer, the IBM 7094, was famous for two reasons. One of them was the passwords, and of course, the very first password breach happened on this device. The other one was, if you're a fan of sci-fi, if you think about like the 2001 Space Odyssey, right? It's a terribly old movie at this point. But if you think about Hal, when Hal gets unplugged, he sings Daisy, right? He sings Daisy and then slowly gets taken offline. Seems weird, doesn't it? Daisy, why is he singing Daisy? Very strange little bit of cinema. I was like, why is that? Well, the reason that was when they were writing the book, when Arthur C. Clarke was writing the book, he was touring computers. He was trying to get a better understanding of it. And IBM took him aside and showed him the IBM 7094. One of their demos at the time to show how cool this computer was to sing Daisy. So Arthur C. Clarke is there, and here's the computer, and it's singing Daisy. He's like, oh, that's good. I should definitely use that. That's going in my book. Because by 2001, we'll be done with passwords and we'll have AI that can sing to us. This is the future. I bring this up because I think it's kind of interesting way that, computing influences sci-fi and vice versa. But B, because for a long time, we thought of AI as being super intelligent, super smart, right? We thought of AI as being like the rosy robot, the robot that can do anything that's sassy and can cook and can clean and push around a vacuum cleaner and balance our checkbooks and everything else. And it's that mentality, I think, that oftentimes gets us in trouble with UEBA and with ML and AI, because we're like, all right, if it's ML and AI, it should be able to think and identify and do all this sort of stuff. And then we're very frustrated when it doesn't. Also, these models, if we feed them too much data, don't necessarily hold up to lots of changes in the environment. When 2020 happened and everyone went home, I started reaching out to a couple of people who I knew had really good UEBA. I'm like, I know you spent like 2 years setting this up. I know you spent like lots of time tuning it. What happens to your model that took you 2 years to tune when everyone changes how they work in a month? And my favorite quote of that was a friend of mine who's a CISO. He goes, yeah, this was the spring when the robots went insane. I'm like, what? He goes, yeah, it just went insane. So it flooded our SIM, flooded us with alerts. We unplugged it, we turned it off. We're going to wait till everything settles and retune it. Because we threw way too much data at this thing, right? It was trying to predict all of human behavior. Why? Because that's how we think about AI. That's how we think about ML. Just have it do everything. By contrast, I think we're starting to see really good successes with ML detection is not with the Rosies, but with the Roombas, with the very purpose-built, very specific systems that are looking at a very small set of data after we've weeded out what we know, the known bad detections. And when we look at them from the perspective of passwordless authentication, we can start looking at things like, how do we get good, well-defined results? What does good look like? Where are people normally logging in? What's their normal pattern? What applications do they launch? What does their device state ordinarily look like? We can get much better data because it's a smaller training set, and that training set doesn't change as frequently. And then when we act on it, we can do better analytics, right? Because with AI models, oftentimes it's very difficult with the high variability of it to really get good ground truth. This was clearly an adversary. Or to go back to my picture example, those are clearly cupcakes, but that's sushi, right? I want a cake, so I guess sushi's okay. Actually, now I want sushi. Never mind, I'd probably end up searching on something different. That was like, but the point is, it gets you close, but not all the way, right? It's very difficult to get to ground truth with these sort of things. So what we want to do is feed this back into the system so we can investigate it, but have very few false positives and act on them when accordingly. We want to make sure that we're not overrunning our SIM, which already is getting tens of thousands of alerts a day. And we also want to make sure that it's really, really high quality data so we're not creating a denial of service condition by security. I think if we can get that, if we got a limited set of data, and if it's acting again after we've already ruled out what we know is bad, if we can eliminate all the, hey, I shouldn't have a jailbroken phone, I shouldn't be running Windows 7, I shouldn't have malware on my endpoint. If we can eliminate all that before we feed the resulting data into the set, we can have a much better analysis and then feed that back in, determine whether or not we're going to allow the user in. So that is the idea with applying ML to increase trust in our authentication models. Bottom line at this stage is we don't necessarily need rosies, we need Roombas, we need something purpose-built, minimum viable, looking at the data and taking out any residual trust that we have to make sure that we don't have to worry about things like stolen biometrics or forged fingerprints or forged facial recognition, all that sort of thing. From there, we can go ahead and start plugging the stack into the rest of our applications. Again, being cognizant of all the things I mentioned up earlier. What part of our user population is not going to be able to support this? What part of our tech stack is not going to be able to support it because it doesn't support the FIDO2 standard or single sign-on standards? What part of our tech stack will not be able to support it because of legacy, mainframe, or what have you? Once we identify what can support, we can go ahead and move that into the passwordless use case and eliminate that password, provide a better user experience, and doing so, of course, get users to move forward with a lot of these ideas about increasing trust and authentication. So I talk about increasing trust and authentication. When I talk about the overall stack, it has to be more than the protocol. We know the protocol is good. We know that works. We know that the device is good. TPMs haven't necessarily been breached in any meaningful way. Yes, there's been a couple attacks, I know that, but haven't been breached in any meaningful way for storing that key material. Secure Enclave in the Apple devices, similar. So we know that the underlying protocol is good. We know the underlying hardware is good. Now we just need to open it up a little bit and think about what other attack vectors adversaries may use to close those loops. And then we go ahead, pick our use cases, rinse and repeat. It becomes a transformation effort. It becomes a project. It becomes everything that we're good at doing in IT. We figure out where we're moving, we move it, we make sure the users are happy, we move on to the next one. Doing it by business unit or doing it by working group or what have you. Of course, if we're moving a whole bunch of these things in, the other risk to be aware of from an enterprise perspective is there's a lot of different companies solving this different ways. So one of the challenges is going to be making sure that we don't end up with a very heavy tech stack with multiple different vendors to maintain. Did a study on vendors in downtime a few years ago. I think this was late 2019, early 2020. And one of the things I found interesting is that organizations with the most vendors had the highest amount of impact, right? So average went from 4 hours to more than 17 hours if they had more than 50 vendors. And at first this was weird to me. This didn't seem right to me. This didn't feel right. I'm like, no, if I'm a CISO and I've got 50 tools, I should be able to get up faster than the guy who only has a couple. This doesn't seem right. But then I remembered one time I had this outage and I called the guys into my office and I'm like, go figure out what's going on. You know, are we under attack? Is there an outage? Is something misconfigured? And they all ran. And they all came back an hour later. And the networking guy's like, I know what the problem is. Got a problem on the switch back plane. Clearly it's a bandwidth issue. There's an issue there. That's the problem. Like, all right, that could be. We've seen that before. Talked to the server guys like, yeah, we looked at our virtualization stack. We're not getting the IO and the CPU throughput. So clearly the problem is there must be a bug in the way that our hypervisors are working. Like, oh, okay. Talk to the security guys. Like, no, it's clearly an attack. Like, all right, I'm sure it is. And every single person had their own perspective on what it was based on what their tool was telling them was wrong. It took us another couple hours before we got everyone on the same page. So intrinsically, I think this makes some sense. If we got a bunch of different tools, we're poised to have longer outages, as well as having to then go up and clean it up and unify policies and everything else to snap things together. So we move things together in this last stage. We put in place more things for federation. We put in place more things for passwordless, and we look for ways that we can have an integrated tech stack without adding a whole bunch of tools. We look for ways that we can have integration between those policy engines and those detective engines. This was a study we just did this year, a security outcome study. They found that organizations with highly integrated tech stacks, the integration between the policy engine, integration between the objects, integration between the orchestration and automation, had 41% stronger detective controls. They reported 41% stronger abilities to respond to events. So in that last stage, what we're trying to do is make sure we don't end up with too many tools and the tools are well integrated and well supported so that we can be in a defensive state. All right, with that, I'll wrap up, answer any questions. So I'm going to start thinking ahead. Passwordless is pretty hot. Lots of people are talking about it, which is good. I think it's an exciting time to finally start moving away from passwordless. However, I think in general, as people, we tend to like define things in terms of what it's not. I come from Detroit, and high tech 100 years ago was not passwordless. High tech 100 years ago was a horseless carriage, right? What is it? It's a carriage without a horse. This is going to be great. We're going to remove the horse. That really belied and hides all the different improvements in speed and comfort and safety that happened from moving to a car, right? This is a horseless carriage. I think that's how we're thinking about passwordless today. I also think, of course, we've learned a lot. We're not in the automotive industry. We're not going to do that again. We're not going to define any innovations by what they're not, except for maybe the driverless car. It really is the state of the way we think as humans. In addition, we know from a criminal perspective, every single control over the past 60 years, every single control we put in place has only bought us time until enough people adopted it. And once enough people adopted it, the adversaries were motivated to work around it. And it has only gotten, those cycles have only gotten quicker in more recent years with people paying ransoms and everything else, with adversaries being more funded. So we know the minute we go ahead and move towards passwordless and move towards adopting these factors, they're going to use weaknesses in factors. They're going to use chinks in our apps and our APIs. They're going to use gaps in our processes for account recovery and identity proofing. The adversaries are going to use all that to compromise our systems. So in moving forward with passwordless, I'd encourage you guys to go ahead and think short-term and long-term, short-term in terms of projects and initiatives and piloting out this technology, longer term in terms of putting in place controls that get ahead of some of these adversary actions that we can predict. I'd encourage you guys to tie it to broader initiatives. So I like it when it's like, oh, we're doing a user experience initiative, or we're doing an IT modernization experience, or customer first initiative. And having passwordless part of that, I think, is much better because, again, oftentimes those things, we don't have a really good user benefit. So this is a great user benefit. And then along those steps, looking at any ways possible to increase the trust and authentication. All right, with that, any questions? I've got a few more minutes. Yes, sir.
I wonder, real world implementation, what kind of issues come to using by a customer, right? But I've tried passwordless with that, things like that.
Yeah. So I haven't seen anyone try passwordless and go back. But the problems that usually happen in a real world implementation would include the tech stack not supporting it, like I mentioned. Also, what's interesting is, there's a lot of privacy concerns around biometrics. And that makes sense because historically we stored all the biometrics in some server system in the back end and trust us, we're going to protect your data. And then we got breached, right? So there is a perception issue, and rightfully so, around biometrics. And with FIDO2 that says, hey, we're not even storing your biometrics, it's on your phone. The biometrics just unlock your phone to get into that enclave. From a technical perspective, that's great. But still, from a human perspective, wait a minute, do I trust that the company is telling me that? Do I believe them? So usually it either runs afoul of the tech not supporting it yet, or runs afoul of the customer organization or culture being suspicious of the change. Yeah. And then again, the edge cases. Just a real quick aside, we spend so much time in our industry. I feel like I'm ranting today. This is Wolf Rant Day. Thank you for that, guys. I appreciate that. We spend so much time in our industry like thinking about the white collar workforce and solving for the white collar workforce in the cloud. And this works great there. But what happens for your factory workers, for your shift workers, for your gig workers? There's a lot of folks that we're not supporting yet, both in this control and other tech controls.
Kind of along those same lines, are there methods or approaches that you've seen more effective in helping bridge that gap for the situations where somebody does have concerns or is resistant to using their own smartphone or smart device, or that the HR or legal issues with that?
Yeah, so the question is bridging that concern. One way to bridge it is, I was showing you the roaming authenticator, is give them keys, right? I love the UTF keys, give them fobs, so it's not even touching the device. that bypasses it altogether and still provides a very high degree of security. Maybe we need to maintain those keys and there's a process behind it, but so that's one way to do it. The other way is just, user education and conversations. I think a lot of folks, once they understand what's going on, are much more open to it. Again, if there's not union rules and other rules in place that we need to worry about. So user education, showing them the benefit. Once you're like, oh, I don't need to log in with the password, this is great. It usually is a tipping point, and looking at fobs. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.